Hello everybody and welcome to Ukraine the Possible, the podcast with a social justice perspective, a view from inside a nation resisting imperialist invasion, a voice in search of solidarity. War has a way of redrawing maps, not just of countries, but of lives. As the world watches the conflict in Ukraine unfold, a silent crisis is taking shape within its borders. Millions of Ukrainians have been forced to flee their homes, not across international borders, but within their own country. We call them internally displaced persons, or IDPs. This isn't just a humanitarian crisis, it's a societal fault line. How Ukraine supports its IDPs will define its future. Are they receiving the help they desperately need? What more must be done? Join us as we delve into the complex reality of displacement in Ukraine, a challenge that touches not just those who have lost their homes, but the very fabric of the nation. What exactly is an IDP? Let's start with the basics. Who exactly are we talking about? Internally displaced persons, or IDPs, are individuals who have been compelled to leave their permanent homes due to conflict, violence, human rights violations, or disasters. But crucially, they remain within their country's internationally recognized borders. In Ukraine's case, they are Ukrainians uprooted by war, seeking safety within Ukraine itself. Both Ukrainian and international law recognizes a special status for IDPs, entitling them to protection and assistance from their government and the global community. But legal rights on paper are one thing, reality on the ground is often another. The critical question we must ask is, are these promised protections actually translating into tangible support for Ukraine's IDPs? And if so, what does that support look like? Displacement before the full-scale invasion, a crisis already brewing. To truly understand the scale of the current crisis, we need to rewind to 2014. This was the year Ukraine first experienced large-scale internal displacement. The trigger, Russia's aggression and annexation of Crimea. Following widespread protests in Ukraine and the removal of President Yanukovych, Russia seized the opportunity. Exploiting the instability, Putin moved to annex Crimea, an act condemned globally and triggering the first wave of international sanctions. This marked the first significant wave of displacement, people fleeing Crimea to mainland Ukraine, while smaller in number compared to what was to come, tens of thousands left, fearing persecution under the new occupying authorities. Later that same year, eastern Ukraine erupted. In the Donbas region, in Donetsk and Luhansk, conflict flared between pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian forces. Fueled and orchestrated by Russia, this fighting tragically led to the deaths of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and forced hundreds of thousands more from their homes. By early 2022, according to the International Organization for Migration and the United Nations Refugee Agency, Ukraine was already grappling with an estimated 1.5 million internally displaced persons. Even before the full-scale invasion, a major displacement crisis was underway. Life as an IDP pre-2022, a struggle for survival. Imagine losing everything, your home, your job, your community. This was the reality for 1.5 million Ukrainians even before February 2022. Arriving in unfamiliar regions, they faced a barrage of challenges. Housing was, and remains, a critical issue. Government accommodation programs were woefully inadequate, failing to meet the burgeoning need. People were forced into temporary shelters, dormitories, even living with relatives, often in overcrowded conditions. The private rental market offered little respite, with soaring prices and economic instability pushing housing further out of reach. For the most vulnerable, the system simply wasn't working. Employment was another battleground. Having lost their livelihoods, IDPs entered already strained labor markets, facing high unemployment and intense competition. Some employers were hesitant to hire IDPs, viewing them as unstable or lacking proper documentation. Financial insecurity became a constant companion. Social integration was equally tough. Misunderstanding, prejudice, even outright hostility from some locals added to the sense of isolation. Social connections, crucial support systems, were absent. Bureaucracy became another hurdle, hindering access to essential services like healthcare and education. State response and the shadow of neoliberal policies. The Ukrainian government did respond, enacting the law on ensuring the rights and freedoms of internally displaced persons in 2014. This law established their legal status and outlined protection mechanisms. Monthly financial assistance was provided, but often fell short due to economic instability and inflation. Employment programs were launched, but their reach was limited. Overall, government measures were hampered by budget constraints and bureaucratic inertia. Policies prioritizing reduced social spending and minimal state intervention weakened the effectiveness of support programs. The influence of oligarchic structures further complicated matters. Powerful business groups, controlling key sectors, showed little interest in redirecting resources towards social programs. Wealth remained concentrated, hindering investment in public welfare and infrastructure. This lack of financial commitment undermined efforts to build robust support systems for IDPs and other vulnerable groups. In this environment, NGOs and volunteer groups, alongside international aid, became lifelines. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Organization for Migration, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and countless others provided vital humanitarian assistance, shelter, supplies, legal aid. However, while crucial, these efforts couldn't fully compensate for the gaps in state policy and resources. Systemic issues remained unresolved. Despite the challenges, progress was made. Legislation created a legal framework, international cooperation raised awareness, and civil society mobilized. But by 2022, Ukraine was already struggling with a significant displacement crisis. Unresolved systemic issues set the stage for an even deeper catastrophe when the full-scale invasion began. The ground shifts. Displacement after February 2022. February 24th, 2022. Russia launched its full-scale invasion. War engulfed vast swathes of Ukraine, striking major cities and critical infrastructure. What followed was a wave of displacement unlike anything seen in recent history. By the end of 2022, the International Organization for Migration estimated over 7 million people were internally displaced, a staggering increase, several times higher than previous years. Families fled under bombardment, often with nothing but what they could carry. As front lines shifted, many were displaced not once, but repeatedly. This unprecedented scale strained infrastructure, local communities, and humanitarian aid to breaking point. People sought refuge in central and western Ukraine, often arriving with no money, no supplies, and nowhere to go. The housing crisis became catastrophic. Schools, sports halls, cultural centers were converted into temporary shelters, but filled up rapidly. Conditions were often dire: inadequate heating, sanitation, and privacy. The private housing market, unregulated and unchecked, reacted predictably. Rents skyrocketed. Affordability vanished, discrimination and exploitation against IDPs became rampant. Some were forced into unsuitable buildings or even onto the streets. International and local aid organizations responded heroically, but the needs were overwhelming. The United Nations, Red Cross, World Central Kitchen, and countless non-governmental organizations mobilized to provide aid. But the sheer scale of displacement meant help couldn't always reach everyone, everywhere, in time. The Ukrainian government also acted, rolling out financial aid, housing assistance, and simplified registration. But with a war-torn economy, state resources were stretched to their absolute limit. By the close of 2022, Ukraine faced one of the largest displacement crises in modern history, a crisis demanding long-term solutions and international support far beyond emergency relief. Evolving government support, tightening the belt. As the full-scale invasion unfolded, the Ukrainian government had to urgently adapt its IDP support systems to an unimaginable scale of need. Millions required help, forcing a rapid rethinking of resource allocation and aid delivery. In the initial months, emergency measures were implemented. Registration was streamlined, facilitating access to social services and financial aid. Monthly payments were increased to reflect rising costs. Temporary housing, medical care, and psychological support programs were launched. However, as the war dragged on and pressure on the state budget intensified, the focus shifted towards optimizing spending. In October 2022, legislative changes tightened eligibility for financial aid. Assistance became more targeted, primarily for those in active combat zones or occupied areas, those with destroyed homes, and vulnerable groups like large families, pensioners, and people with disabilities. Crucially, able-bodied, unemployed IDPs not falling into these categories lost their financial support. New documentation requirements were introduced, housing inspection reports, damage assessments, adding bureaucratic hurdles. The rationale? Limited resources and reported cases of fraud. Focus aid on the most vulnerable and prevent misuse of funds. Sound logic on paper, but with harsh consequences in reality. These cuts sparked immediate backlash. Human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International warned that excluding IDPs from financial support risked worsening their living conditions and violating their basic rights. They urged the government to reconsider the criteria. Bureaucracy became a major obstacle. Gathering required paperwork proved incredibly difficult due to destroyed infrastructure, inaccessible records, and overwhelmed administrative offices. Even those still eligible faced payment delays. The government attempted to address these issues. Mobile registration teams were deployed, online services were introduced, but these measures often fell short of mitigating the impact of the cuts. Financial hardship deepened, hindering IDPs' ability to rebuild their lives and integrate. Amidst the challenges, remarkable acts of solidarity emerged. Local communities opened their homes, organized aid, and created volunteer networks. Civil society and international organizations stepped up to fill the gaps. These initiatives highlighted the resilience and compassion within Ukrainian society. International organizations also adjusted their programs, attempting to bridge the gaps left by reduced government aid, but the needs remained immense, far exceeding available resources, leaving millions facing continued uncertainty and hardship. Currently, IDPs in Ukraine receive approximately 77 euros per month for children or people with disabilities, and around 50 euros for other categories. In 2023, roughly 4 billion euros were allocated for social payments, with 1.5 billion earmarked for IDPs. However, in 2024, financial aid was further scaled back. Eligibility criteria were tightened again, further reducing the number of recipients. Most IDPs were required to reapply, with updated criteria including household income, presence of children, and employment status. To qualify, each family member now had to earn less than 210 euros per month. Officials again cited budget constraints and pressure from international partners, with the Minister for Reintegration stating donors were demanding audits to reduce or optimize payments. But this raises a critical question. In the midst of war and humanitarian crisis, why are social programs being cut, while other areas of spending remain untouched? This approach has ignited criticism and serious questions about the government's priorities. The situation for IDPs in Ukraine remains one of the nation's most pressing humanitarian challenges, even as the number of displaced people has decreased from the peak of the initial invasion. While some have returned to areas like the Kyiv region, significant numbers are returning to frontline areas, places where conditions are often far worse. Daily shelling, landmines, and economic devastation persist. Businesses are shuttered, jobs are scarce. Why are people returning to such dangerous areas? Exhaustion is a major factor. For many, displacement has dragged on for years, taking an immense toll. Simultaneously, in some areas, a semblance of normalcy is returning. People are adapting, trying to rebuild lives amidst the ongoing war. The IOM estimates around 3.5 million people remain displaced within Ukraine as of late 2024. While lower than the peak, this still places immense pressure on social services, the economy, and infrastructure. The enduring challenges of displacement. Millions still live in temporary shelters, dormitories, or with host families. Long-term housing remains a distant dream due to financial hardship and a severe shortage of affordable options. Government housing programs are insufficient, leaving many in overcrowded, inadequate, or unsafe conditions. Job losses and economic instability have driven unemployment among IDPs even higher. Infrastructure damage and the ongoing conflict make job creation incredibly difficult. Financial insecurity fuels poverty and social tensions, impacting both physical and mental health. Healthcare systems are overwhelmed, especially in host regions. Access to basic medical care is limited, with shortages of medicine and personnel. Mental health support is critically lacking, despite widespread trauma. Specialized psychological assistance remains out of reach for many. Education for children and young people is disrupted. School shortages, teacher shortages, and limited resources hinder access to quality education. Online learning is not always viable due to unreliable internet and lack of devices, raising fears of a lost generation. Social integration continues to be a major hurdle. Lack of connections, cultural differences, and stigma contribute to isolation and declining well-being. Competition for resources can fuel tensions with host communities, further complicating integration. While tensions between IDPs and host communities were initially minimal in 2022, problems have grown, often amplified by social media and sometimes fueled by local politics. Despite the overall decline in IDP numbers, the situation hasn't necessarily improved. Disturbingly, reports suggest tens of thousands of Ukrainians are returning to occupied territories. A high-ranking official stated that 150,000 Ukrainians had returned to occupied areas due to insufficient government assistance, a statement later retracted amidst controversy. While the exact number is debated, investigations confirm that some are indeed returning, driven by desperation and lack of options. Reasons for returning are complex. Cuts to financial aid, coupled with the prospect of winter in rented accommodation amidst power outages and attacks, leave some feeling they have no choice, even if it means returning to occupied territory. But the journey is perilous, involving travel through Europe and filtration procedures by Russian security services. Reports from occupied territories paint a grim picture: repression, property seizures, mass confiscations of apartments. Some sources suggest mass returns are not desired by occupying forces, who are instead relocating Russian citizens into these areas. It seems only in the third year of the war has the Ukrainian government fully grasped the scale of the housing crisis for IDPs. Plans are now underway to utilize vacant state and municipal properties and encourage private owners to offer accommodation. A law has been passed to support this. A key initiative is an interactive database of potential housing with digital maps and photos, allowing IDPs to browse and select options. Renovation funding is hoped for through international donors. However, questions remain about the effectiveness of this approach. Ukraine's historical emphasis on private homeownership raises concerns about international funding for what is essentially social housing. Why should international partners fund home ownership projects when Ukraine lacks a robust social housing system? And if European nations have readily provided housing to Ukrainian refugees, why should they subsidize Ukrainian landlords now? Clear answers are still needed. There are some positive steps. IDPs are prioritized for compensation under the e-recovery program. Targeted support is pledged for vulnerable groups. Rental subsidies are planned for 2025 for specific categories of IDPs. Whether this will be sufficient remains to be seen. A rent-to-own scheme is being piloted, but early trials show monthly payments remain unaffordable for most. As of July 2024, a staggering number of IDPs are spending over 70% of their income on rent, and a significant percentage of those experiencing homelessness are displaced persons. Ukraine's housing policy for IDPs clearly needs strengthening, particularly in regulating the rental market. Progressive taxation, regulated rents, tenant protections, and a housing rights ombudsman could offer more effective solutions. But political will is currently lacking. A path forward towards dignity and recovery. Improving the situation for IDPs in Ukraine demands a comprehensive, multifaceted approach, uniting government, international organizations, and civil society. The government must revisit its IDP support programs. Restarting or increasing financial aid, simplifying bureaucracy, and ensuring transparent resource distribution are crucial first steps. Strengthened cooperation with international organizations, United Nations Refugee Agency, International Organization for Migration, World Bank, and others, is essential to bring in additional resources and expertise for affordable housing and home restoration programs. Vocational training, retraining, and entrepreneurship support are vital for creating employment opportunities and boosting economic stability. Job creation in sectors with labor shortages must be prioritized. Investing in healthcare and education infrastructure in host regions is crucial for improving access to essential services. Mobile clinics and educational centers can provide vital support in underserved areas. Promoting social integration through community events and mental health services is essential. Combating stigma and fostering mutual understanding are vital for reducing tensions and building social cohesion. Long-term planning for post-war recovery, focusing on the return of IDPs, is paramount. Investing in infrastructure, the economy, and social services in affected regions will create sustainable conditions for return and rebuilding. IDPs are not just statistics. They are millions of individual stories, each deserving of dignity and support. Every step towards assisting them is a step towards Ukraine's recovery and strengthening. Understanding the scale of this challenge and acting with solidarity is essential to overcome it. Caring for the most vulnerable reflects the maturity of a society and its readiness for lasting peace and growth. To summarize, Ukrainian law guarantees protections for IDPs, but these often remain words on paper. It's not solely about a lack of resources, it's about political decisions shaped by ideologies prioritizing minimal state intervention and influenced by oligarchic interests. The current situation reveals a systemic inability to effectively address the needs of IDPs, and the government's continued focus on reducing social support raises profound concerns. This trajectory must change, or the prospects for a just and equitable future for both IDPs and Ukrainian society as a whole will be severely jeopardized. This podcast relies on credible sources, which are detailed in the description. For further reference, you can access the materials through the provided links.